that a typical graduation at Shari Shamayim was just not going to be possible this past June, we still wanted a special opportunity to celebrate our graduates and their accomplishments. The first stage in celebrating our graduates involved driving around the city to each of their houses with our admin team to present each student with a grad lawn sign and wish them a mazel tov in person with much cheering and clapping. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of what this was all about. So here's Rabbi Grauer with one of the lawn signs, student. After these individualized moments of recognition, we then embarked on our most ambitious plan yet, a physically distanced graduation extravaganza at a drive-in movie theater in Barrie, where we built a large stage that very day, prepared several hundred bags of pre-packaged treats, had a drone capture images of the event, set up a live stream for those at home, and arranged really countless other details to make the class of 2020 feel celebrated and recognized. It was truly a night to remember for many years to come. Just a few more pictures of this to share with you. It was a really wonderful moment to have the big Israeli flag out in Barrie where, you know, there aren't really that many Jews. Some of the cars and some of the signage decorating their cars. Our students up on our stage created in a day and dismantled in a day. And then this really nice message from actually a parent and a graduate. For weeks, we've been feeling so sorry for all the graduates of 2020, whether they're graduating this spring from kindergarten, elementary school, high school, university, or graduate school. But something magical happened last night. Despite all the restrictions mandated by the province because of COVID-19, the Bnei Akiva School's graduation ceremony was truly beautiful, meaningful, and inspiring. True, there were no hugs between students and teachers, but what came across was the intense dedication of the faculty and staff to the success of these students and the incredible resilience and determination of the graduates themselves. From these experiences, our staff and students really learned some very valuable lessons. We learned the power of community and connection, how much we each crave the connectivity with each other, and how we should never take those connections for granted. We learned the importance of the individual within the community and how valuable and affirming it is to take the time to recognize each person's worth and accomplishments. We also learned the value of being flexible and resilient. So when our original plans cannot go as planned, we know not to give up, that there's always another way to achieve our objectives. Lastly, we learned the importance of thinking outside the box and creating new and innovative school traditions. Who knows, some of which may even replace the previous way of doing things. Truly, these are all lessons that extend beyond the classroom and will no doubt remain in the hearts and minds of our school community for many years to come.
Thank you, Sharon. So again, I want to encourage everyone who has a question to just post it in the chat. I'm going to start actually by posing a question to you. You know, I think that it really was exceptional considering the gravity of those months between March and June of last school year. And I guess even morphing into the new reality of school with all sorts of restrictions and social distancing and cohorts, et cetera. You know, you mentioned briefly the idea that some of this becomes opportunities for the future. I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether or not this has fundamentally harmed, right, the educational experience of being in school, or has fundamentally adversely impacted that experience, and in what ways, or conversely, has it taught us something about perhaps, you know, being in the school building in person isn't as critical as we thought it was before, from the perspective of, you know, student activities and building community and so on?
That's a very good question. So I think that it took us a little bit of time to recalibrate, right? Because we're so used to having the opportunity of being together and, sure, we can just organize that all of a sudden students are going to have a dance party, for Yom Ha'atzmaut, and that's just natural and easy and doesn't take as much time and effort and thought, although it does, of course, take time and effort and thought, not to the same extent. So I think that the way that we saw it, or the way that I really felt at the end of June last year, was look at all the opportunities that we have for connections. If we're trying to look back and say, as I mentioned, like, what is our real objective here, right? And our real objective, let's say with graduation, is we want every single student to feel appreciated, to feel celebrated. So we can make that happen in a different way. And I think that ultimately, I know that certainly this is a hard time, and for some kids it was an exceptionally hard time, mental health wise. But I think that the opportunities here are so incredible, and the innovation that we can achieve, to me, is remarkable, right? When you put people together and say, this is what we want to achieve, and let's just try to figure out how to get from point A to point B. So I like to think that there are more opportunities than challenges. That's just my approach.
That's great. It's interesting you say that, because I also picked up on a distinct difference between last school year and this school year. And obviously it's different because last school year we were exclusively home, and this school year we're in school with all sorts of policies in place. But I really felt like last school year, everything happened so fast and was so uncertain at the beginning. I remember thinking that when we first went, I gave this presentation to the students about why we were moving online, and it was all about flattening the curve. And in my head, I was just thinking, yeah, well, once we sort of get through the next few weeks, we'll know where we are, and we'll be back in school at some point. And obviously that didn't materialize. And I think a lot of us felt like it just sort of it was sudden, and then it cascaded more and more as we went on. And then that left everyone, students included, with a feeling of like, woe is us, that this sort of just happened to us. And what was interesting about this year and the summer break was that I think we were able to successfully reset the narrative, even from within the student perspective of, this is now an opportunity to see things differently and do more. So I generally perceive more positivity from last year to this year. And again, obviously the circumstances have changed as well. The other thing that I found sort of interesting, and I would love your thoughts on this, Mrs. Fixler, or Rabbi Sonenberg, if you want to chime in as well. I thought it was really interesting that, school is an interesting animal where 90% of the day, not technically, but the vast majority of the day is spent in class, focused on learning some skills or knowledge set, right? But a lot of what students talk about when they reflect on school is the stuff that happens in the other 10% of the day, right? The teams that they're on, or the co-curriculars that they're doing, or the friends that they have, or just the fun time that they're having. And that's always just been sort of beneath the surface, that there's this thing we do most of the day, and then there's this thing that everyone really likes about school. And it's not to say students don't like learning as well, but that doesn't tend to get as much attention. And I feel like when we pulled students out of school, we really called attention to the fact that they were missing that critical 10% of the day. And even though learning continued online and we were able to finish a school year effectively online, and actually far more effectively than I initially thought it would go, we really were not able to replace, in any sort of broad way, that feeling of being in school. And I wonder if that says something to us about how we structure school, and whether this is even the best structure that we have, where there's so much positive attention given to such a small portion of the day. I wonder if that's just something that's in my head, or if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think that kids often find that those extracurricular pieces or the co-curricular pieces are so meaningful to them, because the learning is, of course, in the background at all times, right? It's something they have to do, whereas they're often choosing to participate, right, in the extracurriculars or the co-curriculars. So having that option, I think, for them makes it more appealing, where you're buying into it. It's a good question. I don't know that there's any good answer really, except for the fact that it's nice for students to feel that now they have the opportunity to think things through, I think, a little bit more clearly in terms of how they want this year to look, right? Because as you said, Mr. Rapp, it was a difference of like we had to put things in play, and it was, you know, an emergency and contingency, and it was just, there was no real choice and planning that we could do. But now we feel like there's more thought that can go into trying to balance those different needs and trying to create those extracurriculars. Like, for example, you know, trying to say that, okay, we're going to have lunch and learn opportunities for students even this year. And we're going to make sure that those opportunities are happening where only one group of students at a time in a very wide space in the shul are eating, and everyone gets to have like the physical distance space to listen to the shiur on different days. Like, so to put in all those little pieces into play so that we could have those extracurricular experiences even during this challenging year.
Excellent. And there was a question posted in the chat that I'm really gonna pose to both of you, and maybe Rabbi Sonenberg, you want to take this one first, just, you know, to transition to your next part. Do you think kids can get the same learning experience being online?
I mean, I don't think they can get the same learning experience, but I mean, definitionally, but I think they can definitely get a quality learning experience. I think it's different. And I mean, if you want to transition, if you want me to take over, I'm happy to kind of take over and transition into this point. I think that online, and certainly with the experience that we have right now, I think it's an opportunity almost to reconsider our educational plan. Certainly on the Judaic side, I find that, I mean, sometimes we tend to be very focused on content and not a lot about connection. And with our new shift, because everybody is online potentially, or people, I mean, our current assumption is that students have access, because if they're writing a test from home, they have access to all the internet, all their notes and such. And therefore, I mean, testing them on knowledge would be on some level somewhat pointless and it'd be a waste of our time. And not to mention the fact that in terms of our current plan, it seems to be that when it comes to education, knowledge has become cheaper and cheaper over time. I mean, in terms of, I mean, when I was in school, or my parents were in school, or my grandparents were in school, I mean, it was very important to remember facts, because you'd have to go to the library to look them up, and like you can't access anything. But now everybody knows everything, because you just got to take out your phone, and if you have an important question about a fact that happened, you can figure it out in about 10 seconds. Right? It doesn't require that much knowledge to know anything, because all you need to know is how to use Google. And we've considered this in terms of education in the past, and I think that it's a really good opportunity, almost like it's accelerating education and shifting it in terms of the idea of skill acquisition and connection to the material. So I do believe that it's possible to have a good education online, and I think that we're really in an opportunity to really reconsider education in a way that can be very powerful. I want to share a few things. One, like in terms of small details, and some in terms of like impactful things that I think can happen. One interesting thing is that right now, I mean, students don't even have lockers, right? So students can't have lockers, which means that on some level, other than maybe they don't have phys ed, so maybe we should make them bring books, so give them exercise to carry their books around. But it's not so easy to have the students carry every single book with them every single class. And the idea of online tools has always been a question in Judaics. You know, the traditional idea of having a sefer in front of you and learning out of a sefer as opposed to learning online has always been a very important question. But if we go ahead and we look, I'm just going to share with you. I mean, we have here, for example, this website, AlHatorah. If you look in terms of the resources that are available, this is their Mikraot Gdolos. So if I ask the student to bring a Chumash to class versus the online version. Online, let's just look for a second at all of the Mafarshim that are available, right? This is a huge amount of resource that students have at their fingertips, right? So just in terms of like, say, students, if they don't have a book, they certainly have access to an unbelievable resource of the Mafarshim that we're going to be discussing in class in terms of their ability to actually see things. But the technology is extremely powerful in terms of teaching skills. We're all familiar, for example, with the idea of like maybe a milah mancha or a light word, where we see the idea of a text and we want to go ahead and figure out how that text plays out in terms of which words are important, right? And oftentimes the repeated words have significance. Right, so if you go ahead, you see as I highlight different words, you'll see how many times they're appearing in the text, and it'll bring it all up. On the side, you can tell you, so which words, which ones appear most. So Elohim is 32 times in this chapter. But you can see also, it's not just the number of times a word appears, because sometimes a word is kind of boring, like say Vayomer. Right, so is Vayomer significant or not? So then it'll tell you, well, what is it relative to percentage in Tanakh? Right, so if I say, well, based on Tanakh, I see Rakia is a very rare word. right? So they can go ahead and they can discover pieces of the text, which will show them potentially the theme of the text based upon these words, these key words, these light words that are picking up. Additionally, we can teach them how to use, for example, here you highlight, you can see, for example, Vayavdel, you can bring a concordance up, which is again a tool that students generally haven't been using in terms of, they don't use textbooks in terms of that, but I mean, it's fascinating in terms of like this idea of Havdalah, right? And if you gave the students a task and say, what does the word mean? The ancient dictionary was a concordance, not just a dictionary, but like you say, well, how's the word used? And that will tell me the meaning of the word. And if you go ahead and you look at it, you can see it in Bereshit, like we have in our chapter, that God's differentiating between, we can see between light and dark, right? And in terms of the creation. And if you go ahead and you look at it and say in Sefer Vayikra, you have Kodesh and Chol, right? If you go ahead though and you wanted to look, say for example, in Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll see that it's talking about the nation from others, right? So it's interesting. So I mean, if they look at this idea of Havdalah and they use the concordance and you teach them how to use this skill, all of a sudden, if we wanted to have a shir and they can do research about the whole concept of, Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'chol, ben or l'choshech, ben Yisrael la'amim. What's this idea of Havdalah and the idea of differentiating for purpose, perhaps? Like we can see in Sefer Bamidbar, right? He's differentiating the Levium and saying they have a job to do. This is differentiation for purpose, not just for discrimination, if that makes sense, right? There's goals and purpose. And again, there's so much that they can learn just by using these simple tools. Additionally, if you go ahead and you look in terms of this tool, right, you can also compare text. So if I wanted to compare and contrast text within Tanakh, I can pull up, say, the Aseret Dibrot in Shmot and Dvarim. I pull both texts up, and magically, it will go ahead and compare the text, and I can go ahead and see where there's differences and identify the significance of the differences. I can teach them how to use this skill. So not only do I have them not using a textbook, but it's not just simply that they have an online tool, but it's to teach them the power of this online tool, right? And if continually on this idea, so Sefaria is also a very well-known site. Oftentimes, I don't know if everybody knows the power of Sefaria, right? So if I were to go ahead, look, there's a really interesting idea here. They have this, I don't know if anybody's checked this out, the visualizations as a tool, right? So if I were to go ahead and look at these Link Explorer here, I'll say, I want to go ahead and find the connections between Tanakh and Gemara. So you'll notice, for example, in Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim, see how thick the lines are. Again, just as a very quick visual, you can see that the legal text that we're drawing from is drawing heavily from, obviously, Chamisha Kumshei Torah. When I move it into the Nevi'im, you'll notice that the lines are a lot thinner, right? It's not as halachically powerful. When it comes to the Nevi'im Achronim, you're going to notice it's a little bit more. But again, there's a lot of Nevuah and messages in terms of that. Tehillim, powerful also, because again, a lot of that has to do in terms of the follow it goes to brachot, right? You can see there. And obviously, if you were to go ahead and look, you would find that Esther would be powerfully in Megillah, right? You can also go ahead and check out, for example, the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, again, teaching them these connections and visualizing and seeing this, right? You can see, for example, if you wanted to say Orach Chaim, well, where's it drawing from? Right? You can see, you can see the Masechta it draws from, and you can see the theme based upon the Masechta. If you wanted to go ahead and look in, what's it called? In Choshen Mishpat, you can see it's drawing from the Babas and Nashim. If you want to look at Yoredea, which they always say is the collection of everything, you can see, actually, it is the collection of everything. It's drawing laws from everywhere. So again, it's a tool that I think students can use and explore. But in addition to this, in terms of what Sefaria offers us, just looking in a text for a second. So if I go ahead and I look, let's go here. We're going to look in Bereshit. And if we look here, and so we're going to see, in terms of Mefarshim, obviously we have the ton of Mefarshim, but if I wanted to go ahead and go further, I can see, interestingly enough, I can see on web pages, in other words, where this pasuk is sourced. And if I wanted to go, for example, we can mention Rabbi Sachs, alav hashalom, zecher tzadik livracha. We can go ahead and we see here, look, we see all of the articles, right, that Rabbi Sachs talks about using this pasuk of Havdalah. Right, so the ethics of holiness, the idea of purpose. And again, the students cannot just say, look at classic Mefarshim, but they can go ahead and see how it's being used by modern thinkers, right, and get access to that. So it's important to teach students skill, and then you can give them, instead of assessing them, what did this say, right? So I taught them how to use the concordance and research, for example, for this word Havdalah. But I can go then now, instead of testing them on what do we know about Havdalah, I can test them about using a concordance. I can test them about, I show them how to compare and contrast the story of the AlHatorah Dibrot, but I can give them a task to go ahead and say and compare and contrast the story of the Meraglim as seen in Devarim and as seen in Sefer Bamidbar, and pick up the themes based upon similar words. I can show them how to use key words and identify which ones are going to be driving the story and which ones are kind of background words, and teach them how to find those tools. And if assessments are based on that, then we're not just getting students who are parrots and capable of repeating back what I said to them, but I get students who are actually thinkers and who can analyze and can actually apply. And I think that's a dramatic shift in education, but I think it's a good shift. And it's almost like this particular crisis has created an opportunity to reimagine education in a way that is much more powerful. When I teach Gemara, for example, I'm always going to go ahead, and now, like, my assessments used to be maybe 10%, 20% application. Now I have a very strong focus on the idea of unseen Gemara and getting students to actually analyze text, both based literally in terms of the textual analysis and also based upon their capacity to understand concepts and then apply them. So I think it's really been an opportunity for education. And I see it as, whether we're in COVID or not COVID, I think that it's certainly an opportunity for teachers to reimagine how they educate and certainly reimagine how they evaluate.
Thanks, Rabbi Sonenberg. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to just post them directly in the chat, and I'll be sure to get to them. Rabbi, I was going to ask you, you know, we've all been through this. Our assessment policy in school this year has changed dramatically in that we are, because we have students who are opting to learn from home and students who are learning in school, we've essentially created an open notes, an open book testing policy, which has, I think, for all teachers, shifted in the way you described, shifted away from you know, knowledge questions to application questions. And I'm curious how students feel about this. I can share, you know, I had a student remark to me in my economics class just last week that the assessments are harder than they were when we just had tests, but they feel like they're learning the material better, and they're happier to not have the pressure and stress of tests. I wonder how your students feel with this shift on the Judaic studies side, and are they reflecting positively on it or negatively, or, and I would wrinkle into that, is that, you know, sometimes negative can be good if it's creating more learning. So I wonder how your students feel about this.
Well, I do have the advantage of teaching grade 9 students, so they don't really know what's flying relative to anything in terms of, they just go, they get, this is high school. I guess it's a big difference between grade 8 and grade 9. I guess this is what happens in high school. So I haven't had complaints, certainly in my class. It's interesting, by the way, in terms of academically, I mean, just historically, the class averages are pretty much the same as they've always been. In other words, I haven't noticed a big shift. But at the same time, I've noticed a shift in the way that I teach. In other words, I have a much stronger emphasis on the skill acquisition, and I make that extremely clear to the students. In other words, highlighting that point, I'm giving a lot of time in classes, practices in terms of these unseen Gemaras and the opportunity there. So I mean, I think the students are prepared. As long as I think that, I mean, I've heard from other classes in terms of, like, you know, I think language is actually a particularly challenging course, especially with, like, you know, Ivrit, where there's vocabulary tests, and how do you test vocabulary with an open notes, right? That can be quite a challenge. And when you give an open note test for Ivrit, I found that I've heard from the complaints that it's actually much harder because now you actually have to apply the words and use the words, as opposed to simply write a translation where it's just memorize, spit back. You're actually doing a lot more, and it's become a bit more challenging, but I think there's going to be a lot better education. So I agree with you in somehow that sometimes complaints aren't bad.
You know, there's one other thing that as you're talking really struck me, which is, you know, in my time in education, so I guess over the last, 15 years or so, there's really been a significant move away from teacher discretion in marking, right? Like when we all went to school, you kind of were at the mercy of whatever your teacher decided they liked in your answer and what they didn't. And the move sort of within the professional education world has been to really create more concrete rubrics, more very clear communication for students about what's expected of them. So it leaves less to teacher discretion and much more should be spelled out at the beginning. And I think we probably all would agree that that's a good move overall. But I think what's interesting is as you shift more to application questions and more to unseen questions, you really give the teacher a lot more discretion in the marking, even with a rubric or clearer success criteria for marking. And I wonder how you feel about that. And Mrs. Fixler, you can share on this as well, especially teaching English. Like, is that something that is harder to do? Is something that's more challenging from a student perspective, where students are pushing back on their marks more because they feel like they didn't understand the expectations from the beginning? Or is that better? Because at the end of the day, part of learning is figuring out what the person who's giving you the task wants of you, right? Like, that's what we all do in our jobs every day. We sort of have to figure out what people want of us, and that there's a skill in that as well. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Right. I think that there's definitely some flexibility, but at the same time, I'm not open to the idea of kind of arbitrary marking. I mean, I think that I agree that rubrics are essential. In other words, students need to know their definition of what is a success criteria. What is their goal here? How can they demonstrate mastery of this particular skill? Which means that, again, like any good class, I mean, that would be the teacher would have the opportunity to demonstrate that to the students, have the students have the opportunity to practice that skill with feedback, where, I mean, the test should never be a surprise. Obviously, if it's just a vocabulary test, then the teacher doesn't really have to model what would be a correct answer if it's just translate this word. But if there is a skill that the student is expected to demonstrate, so then I think that as long as the teacher is clear in advance with clearly defined expectations and rubrics, with feedback in advance for practice, so then I don't think that we're going to be left to this idea of the whim of subjectivity on the moment. And I think students need to have that clarity going into an assessment, knowing what they need to do in order to be successful.
Mrs. Fixler, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I find it so interesting. I don't know, Rabbi Sonenberg, if you or Mr. Rapp, if you've experienced this, but I just had to create an assessment, like for a short story unit study for grade 9 also, and open notes and everything, open resources. And I found it really hard to create because it was all application, and it was all like, okay, let's take a passage from here. And I gave the kids the heads up about this, and we modeled how it would look. Take a passage from the text and say, what does this passage show us about a particular character's characteristics, right? So creating a whole set of questions that aren't just knowledge or pretty straightforward thinking, I think took more effort on my end, which was interesting that I found, having taught the same years, but I found it to be like a richer experience for students, right? Because they know they have all their resources there. You really eliminate, as Rabbi Sonenberg was saying, like kind of that nervousness or the anxiety piece, but it's also a tremendous lesson for them that you still need to study. Right? And we spoke about that ahead of time. Like, you can't just say, listen, I'm coming to the assessment. I've got all my resources, whatever, I don't need to prepare. And you have to actually take the time to practice and feel more familiar. But then ultimately you feel, I think, a little bit more of a sense of satisfaction that you understood and could apply your knowledge.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced redoing things that we had prepared and done, especially for teachers who are teaching courses, that they've taught in the past, that there's like sort of a new preparation process, which, if you like teaching, is somewhat inspiring in and of itself, to sort of go back and rethink things in a new way. So a couple of questions that were posted in the chat. And this one, I'll take a shot at first. Do you think the changes you've implemented this year in teaching approach will affect them for university or future job, or they're unrelated and things will go back to normal post-pandemic? I think that's a really great question. So I'm gonna separate job and university because I think those are very different things. I actually think that we could knock ourselves as an education system in saying that there's not a whole lot. Well, let me rephrase that. There's a lot of what we do that really doesn't have applicability to the real world functioning in a job. For example, in a job, you never have 8 consecutive meetings a day with completely different subjects of the meetings and completely different sets of tasks that you have to follow up on. That does not mirror itself in the real world at all. And yet through all 12 plus years of education, there's just this inundation of different teachers and assignments and subjects and things you have to do. That's not something that transitions to the job market. On the other hand, in the quote unquote real world, when you have a job, understanding human communication, understanding what people are asking of you, figuring out how to think creatively about problems, These are all things that are really important. So I would venture a guess that a lot of these changes, especially the ones that Rabbi Sonenberg was just discussing, will have huge advantages for students entering the job market, both in terms of their ability to do independent research, their ability to analyze unseen information. All of that is really valuable. The university system, I'm not sure if the university system is changing as quickly as a local small high school is able to change, where we can all have very intimate and close discussions with each other about what's in the best educational interest of our students. So in that sense, I just don't know whether that's going to change, or whether the university system, which is a behemoth of momentum, will just snap right back to giant lectures and 50-question multiple choice tests and all the wonderful things we remember from our time in university. I'm just not sure that will change, but I have high hopes for what it means for the job market. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that, in terms of Judaics and university, I'm not worried about that in terms of the impact of that. But I do believe that in terms of the job market of being like, avodas Hashem, right? In terms of that job, I do believe that this is actually better for the job market. In other words, having students that develop connection to text, that are engaged with the text and think about it, as opposed to students who know what to spit back. I think that is a huge difference in terms of their ability to live as a Jew. And I wouldn't want to ever go back if I could.
Excellent. I have another question for you, Rabbi Sonenberg. You mentioned that your experience is that marks haven't changed. Would the same students who excel or struggle in the previous testing environment also be excelling in the current? Or do you see a change in sort of the population that's excelling and not? If so, how much of the change is reflective of the pedagogical method, and how much is simply based on the natural abilities of students? This is an excellent question. To put simply, does the teaching testing matter, or are these distinct differences for students? This is a correlation causality question at its core.
I think it's very difficult to separate everything, because there's so many variables that are changing in terms of, I know that my teaching method has changed as well. I do know that some students are much better at spitback and some students are much better at application. I've seen some students who can perform excellently with the skill. They might have natural talent, or they might have a certain aptitude in the subject, but they just don't have the memory skills. So I think you'll definitely find a difference between the students. But I'm saying overall, and I have a very narrow group of students. I do teach the advanced Gemara here. But overall, I find that they're all engaged. And to tell you the truth, even though the focus is on skill, just as an aside, it's fascinating that they still are very focused on the content as well. In other words, they care about the content. It's not like we're dropping the content for the skill. We're doing actually both. But in terms of the causation, I don't know. I think it's a little bit difficult to pull out that.
Yeah, I would second that thought. I've often had students who are really good at spitback and find application much more challenging, and likewise, students who just don't have as good a memory tend to not do that well on spitback questions. Okay, for the sake of time, I want to go to our third part, which is me. I'm really going to try actually to zoom out significantly in this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bnei Akiva School's experience, but I want to talk about it in the context of a broader educational question. So I really want to cover 3 points. First, I want to articulate what I see as the big challenge for education in 2020. Now, this challenge existed before COVID, but I think COVID creates a unique way to look at this challenge differently, or a unique opportunity to advance with this challenge. So I'm going to articulate the big challenge for education. The second part I want to cover is what happened during COVID, really at the start of March of last year and moving into this year. And that's really from my perspective as Director of Education at Bnei Akiva Schools, and the program or the programmatic changes that we made, some of which were touched on by Mrs. Fixler and Rabbi Sonenberg. And then I want to circle back to that big challenge and see if any of this sort of new COVID reality gives us momentum or an opening to address the big challenge. So I would start by articulating the big challenge this way. Education hasn't really changed that much in the last 100 years, right? There's not another industry out there that's like that, right? I mean, if you think about it, we have parents and grandparents on this call. Your children are studying more or less the same curriculum that you likely studied in high school. They're learning algebra and geometry and the same basic topics in science. And sure, there's new stuff mixed in and there's new features, but overall, the curriculum is more or less the same. They're still moving from room to room when the bells ring. They're still being taught primarily by teachers in the front of the room. Now there's teachers who do things differently and move around, and there's a lot more innovation there, but the overall structure feels a lot like it did for the last 100 years. Now, I think that should be surprising to all of us. When education started and we started moving students, let's talk about public education, right? When we started moving students into buildings and shuffling them along in periods and dividing them arbitrarily by like a 12-month period that they were born in, right? This kind of made sense because you had a smaller number of people who could deliver the education, who could create the learning, than the number of students who were receiving the learning. You had no other way of delivering learning than through an individual teacher. And you had a massive desire to scale up learning because at the beginning of education, you go back 100 to 150 years ago, education was about literacy. So at that time, you were still teaching the majority of the population to read, and that was something novel, and about numeracy, right? And so the idea was on a large scale, you wanted to educate an entire population with basic foundations in literacy and numeracy. Now, as you travel along, into the current time period, that morphs and changes by virtue of the university system really feeding, becoming I guess you could say, a vacuum from the primary and secondary school system. So all of a sudden, the goals of the university system and the values of the university system became the important values that all the feeder schools had to teach toward, because more and more and more students wanted to go to university. So while, in the 1920s or 30s, it would be an exceptional thing for a student post high school to go to university, you get to the 1950s, 60s, and then into our time today, and more students are just expecting that university is their next goal. So that curricular structure became much more robust, but also much more rigid. Like, you must teach algebra, geometry, calculus, biochemistry, physics. These are all the important things you need to do, where if you ask why they're important, the only answer that I think you can come up with for specifically those subjects is, well, you need those subjects to get into the program you want to get into in university, right? There are cognitive skills that all of those subjects build. For example, algebra builds critical thinking skills, but there certainly are other ways to build critical thinking skills. And in fact, for a student who is numerically inclined, algebra can be very good at critical thinking skills. But for a student who might be more verbally inclined, philosophy or logic might be better at building critical thinking skills. So it's not the core skill, it's really the subject and the fact that the subject is required for students to advance to the next level of their education. So that's one problem. The second problem that builds into this is that when we started, let's call it factory style education or mass education 100 years ago, we kind of assumed all people learn the same, right? And if you just sort of go through these basic steps of, here's the information, commit it to memory, we're going to test you on the information, every human being can learn the same. And I had this experience growing up, and I'm sure many other people on the call had this experience growing up, that some teacher or adult figure in their life, when they couldn't learn something, just assumed they were being lazy or weren't trying hard enough, right? And in fact, that wasn't the case. You actually just were not able to learn through one standard method of delivery. We now know, every educator who takes their profession seriously knows, that there is a myriad of ways that individual students learn, that individual human beings learn. And we're actually just really scratching the surface of actually understanding how unique and distinct our learning apparatuses are. But what we do know now is age doesn't matter that much, especially in high school, right? Where students can, in grade 9, can learn material that's being taught in grade 12. And sometimes students in grade 12 really need to go back to grade 9 and pick up certain skills that they might have glossed over. We've learned that social promotion is really detrimental to advancing and learning. So if a student just moves up every year because their age group moves with them, that they have gaps. I can't tell you how many students we encounter in high school who come into high school with the idea that I'm not a good math student, right? And when we drill down, we actually just did this with one of our classes. When we drill down on the skills and we sort of just go, here are your skills from grade 5 through grade 8, and we're just gonna test you diagnostically on those skills, you discover that they're just gaps. Nobody ever taught them to add fractions. And so forever, but of course they were promoted on. So forever they've been reinforcing this notion that they're a bad math student, when meanwhile there's just some skill gap there that needs to be discovered. And so that becomes really important when you think about how we structure school altogether. And so I think that brings us to just this big challenge of is the current structure that we have for school actually the most effective structure for learning, right? Is education, I would phrase it this way, is education good for learning? Education as a system and a structure, the most effective way to promote learning? Now, this is a question that was not created with COVID. This was a question that's been around and been tossed around in educational circles actually for a long time. The best book on this, if you're interested in high school education, is there's a man named Theodore Sizer, who ran the education school at Harvard for a number of years, and he also started a network of schools called the Coalition of Uncommon Schools, I believe they're called. And he wrote a book in 1984 called Horace's Compromise. And Horace is a teacher, and the book essentially illustrates all the compromises Horace has to make in the course of his teaching, basically compromising learning for the sake of the system and its structure. He wrote this in 1984, and it's kind of depressing to read it today because there isn't all that much difference between what he's talking about and the problems he's identifying then and what we're experiencing now. Except there is one significant difference, and that is technology has opened up a world of possibility that was not available, and it's we have to remind ourselves of this, even 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago. And that's a fascinating possibility. Just to put it in perspective, there's not an industry that is built on communication. So whether that's the entertainment industry or the news industry or media generally, that has not been completely disintermediated, right? Where you remove that middleman by virtue of the internet and the mass availability of information. The one industry that hasn't been disintermediated, that's still built on communication, is education. In education, we still primarily pass information through the teacher, right? And the teacher is the guide for the students in almost all areas. While there is a wealth of information available out there from a wealth of different personalities and teachers that is essentially at your fingertips. So this is the big challenge. So let's put that on the side for a second. And I want to just talk a little bit about COVID and how we reacted and responded to that. So in many ways, when this is, to Rabbi Grauer's great credit, when we started, generally it's the opposite in Bnei Akiva schools. Rabbi Grauer is an eternal optimist and I am an eternal pessimist. But when it came to COVID, Rabbi Grauer believed we were closing pretty much from the minute COVID started, spreading around the world and getting into the news. And I was much more skeptical that would happen. And when New York schools started closing, which was about a week to a week and a half before we closed, Rabbi Grauer said to me, we really got to get on this. Now, in many ways, we were fortunate in that we had already designed courses that are blended courses, meaning partially online and partially in person. And we also had fully online courses that we were running. So our experience in the area of online learning was not, nothing. We weren't starting from scratch. We really had built some knowledge to start. And from the beginning, we decided that we were going to work on a model where we were going to blend asynchronous and synchronous learning. Now, if you have children in school, you all know what those terms mean at this point. And that's probably one of the greatest accomplishments of education during COVID, is that every single high school student and a good number of middle school students know what asynchronous and synchronous means. But if you don't happen to know, asynchronous learning is learning where the learning is taking place without the teacher and students being live together with each other, whether that's on a Zoom like we are now, or whether that's in class. And synchronous learning is your sort of more classical model of learning where teacher and student are live together. And what we understood from the beginning was putting students on Zoom all day, every day, keeping them on 8 hours of Zoom classes was not going to be conducive to learning or to just their overall health. And so we were going to need to mix asynchronous and synchronous learning in order to make this an effective experience. Getting that balance right has been a challenge, and getting it right per subject and per teacher style has also been a challenge that we still struggle with. So I think that model opened up a really interesting world for us, because all of a sudden, if you think about it, when I'm teaching a class, if it's me and let's say 20 students in the classroom, I have one mouth and one voice. And so I can only focus on one thing at one given time period. But if you take me away from being in the front of the classroom, and all of a sudden, I'm not a communicator of learning, but I'm a curator of learning. So I'm not looking to actually articulate the learning necessarily myself, but I'm looking to curate content that's already out there and deliver that to students. Well, now I don't have to have all the students working on the same piece of content at once. I could have 3 or 4 packages of content, each with a different style, each perhaps focusing on a different area of interest for the student, and then being able to sort of customize these packages of content and work with those students individually. Now let's take that to the next stage. And this is the third part of what I want to cover, which is, well, now all of a sudden, wait a minute, why do I have to have students separated by age? Let's say there's a student in grade 9 who's advanced enough that they want to start doing advanced functions or calculus work. Or they just happen to share an interest with a student in an older grade, and they want to work on that project together. Well, if there's one teacher, I have to create a whole nother section for them. That's going to cost, somewhere between, $10,000 and $13,000, depending on where your teacher places on salary scale. And it's not economically worth it to have one teacher doing that for 3 students. But if I could have one teacher curating a package of content for those 3 students, while the same teacher is curating 3 or 4 other packages of contents for other groups of 3 or 4 like-minded students who may be of different age ranges and different cognitive skill sets, then that could work. Not only that, why does a student have to learn between September and June, which is essentially the agrarian calendar? And by the way, that started in education because young people were meant to work in the fields during harvest season and in the summers. That's why students have summers off. There's no particular reason why, if a student needs an extra couple of months to grasp a concept, that they can't take that time, because again, they don't need me, the teacher, present. I curated the curriculum for them. They need me as a coach. They need me to guide them through the process of learning, but they don't need me primarily to deliver the learning. So all of a sudden, the whole time frame of learning changes. And when the time frame of learning changes, the biggest disruptor is that the scale of marking changes. We all are used to this sliding scale of marking, right? And educators in the world of, the upper echelon of education and the Ministry of Education will tell you that every student is marked individually and nobody is marked relative to their peers. But that is just transparently false. And anyone who's selling that, you shouldn't buy that. Because at the end of the day, if you're marked on a sliding scale within a fixed time range, you're marked relative to your peers. That's exactly the way it goes. And every university who's accepting students into one program or another is looking at their marks relative to other students' marks, right? So the whole idea that you need to be marked relative to your peers is a function of a single curriculum and a single time frame for learning. If you remove that, and now you're curating different curricular packages for different students to learn over an infinite time frame, obviously not infinite, but potentially infinite if they want to stick with it for that long, then you can teach to mastery, right? You could expect that every student will master the material that's set out for them. And all of a sudden, the whole nature of courses changes. I don't have to teach a course that has 5 distinct units in it, and all of those 5 units of learning are distilled into one number. why not just say, geometry and algebra, which are taught together in a math course, those are completely different cognitive skill sets. Maybe I can master geometry, but I need another month or two to really master algebra, because I'm really good with visual representations, but I'm just not so good at processing numbers that I see in front of me. And so the whole dynamic of education can change where we're educating toward mastery. And this is a personally important thing for me, because when I was in primary school, I didn't learn to read till I was in the 3rd grade. And that's on account of the fact that I have a language-based learning disability, which, by the way, didn't get diagnosed until I was in my 2nd year of university. And the reason for that was no one ever cared to diagnose it. I don't have a better reason than that. I don't, bless my parents, like I don't, I was good enough, and they just assumed, well, he's a B and C student, and for whatever reason, he's not learning how to read, but he'll get there. And I got promoted on through the system. And that professor in university, my English professor in my 2nd year of university, who recognized that there's something's up here, he really changed my life. And what I find so interesting when I reflect back on my experience as a kid, which was traumatic, and anyone who was a delayed reader on this call will know that it's a traumatic experience when they like pull you out of the classroom, right? There was like the Eagles reading group. I don't know if any of you had the Hawks and the Eagles. The Hawks were like the good ones, and the Eagles were the secondary ones. And then there was like Hillel, Rapp being walked out of the room because you know how to read. That was a really formative experience. And when I think about that, I think about the fact that actually no one ever said, well, you don't know how to read, you're just not going to know how to read, right? That was so fundamental. The expectation that everyone has to master reading was so fundamental to the learning experience that the system just gave me enough time to learn how to read. And that's essentially what it took, right? But we don't do that with other subjects. When it comes to algebra, if you can't master the basics of algebra by the end of grade 9, you're learning something else in grade 10, right? You're moving on to advanced algebra, or you're moving on to the next subject. But why do we treat reading differently, right? Why do we say, oh, this is a really important one? I mean, I get that it's important, but any subject given enough time can likely be learned, or a student decides that that's not really what they want to learn and they choose something else. So here's where I think this all comes together in an interesting sort of way, where I think that the big challenge of why education is the same as it was 100 years ago, all of a sudden, the fact that everyone's been forced to do some form of blended learning through this experience of COVID, all of a sudden opens us up to a world of possibilities where the teacher can move from being primarily a communicator of curriculum to being primarily a curator of curriculum. And that, I think, holds promise for being massively disruptive across the education system. Now, I'm not naive. I think that there is a huge, overwhelming tidal wave of force that works against this, and that is just institutional forces. The fact that there's a whole system of education functioning, but I do think that there's really a distinct opportunity here, because even teachers, and I think I think my colleagues will agree with this, and I know there's some other administrators, educational administrators on the call who will probably as well. We have all been shocked by the teachers who have adapted themselves to this system. Teachers who 2 years ago, I would have mulled over even asking them to do something that was remotely technological, because I don't know if it's going to throw them off kilter, and teachers are talent professionals and they're delicate in that way, and maybe we should be careful. And all of a sudden, a huge apparent need arises, and there's just been massive adjustments on the part of teachers you wouldn't have thought that would occur for. And so I'm cautious, although I'm not generally optimistic. I am cautiously optimistic that this moment might move us forward in a significant way. Okay, so Sharon, Mrs. Fixler, Rabbi Sonenberg, I don't know if you have any questions for me.
I mean, I could have questions on you, but I'm a bit yuckish, so I feel like you ran the clock out, and I think you were trying to avoid questions.
Ms. Sonenberg, it's just that 9 o'clock is generally your bedtime. So I wasn't going to share that with everyone, but that happens to be true.
Exaggerating.
Yeah, I've gotten some very nice feedback in the chat. I'll pose one question that came up. Do you think the students feel like they are missing out on milestones, special events, and experiences as a result of what's going on. I feel like Mrs. Fixler, this really relates to what you were discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there was a time period, you know, just referring back to the actual graduation, for example, that we experienced, but there were a few months there where things were looking very grim with COVID and the world and the lockdown that was continuing. And students were truly mourning, for lack of a better word, the loss of the usual rites of passage for graduation that they, you know, hold so near and dear. And that's really just a trademark and a hallmark of our school. And then when all the new ideas came up, there was the hype that was created. And I think that this is what I really think is so important, that we were able to model for the students, look, we can be flexible, we can be resilient, we can say it's not going to be what it was. And we recognize and we embrace the fact that that's hard for you and that's not what you were expecting, but we can still create something so beautiful and memorable. And that the kids even say, yeah, for sure, right? That was way better than what we thought we were going to have, like the normal, usual routine.
I like that point about resilience. You know, I feel like all of us here, parents, grandparents, teachers, will probably nod our heads at the idea that there's a level of entitlement that moves up with generations, just by virtue of the relative levels of comfort that we have and technology and privilege. And I think that this has been an interesting moment where even though students have lost out on experiences, they've gained opportunities to educate towards resilience in a certain way, which I think is really fascinating. Another question came into the chat: how would you apply remote teaching and learning to physical education? I think that's a really interesting question and a fascinating challenge for us this year, where even though we are in school, the restrictions that we have on the in-school environment have made physical education challenging. Thank goodness until today, the weather has actually been phenomenal, almost as if like someone's nodding on us and saying, you know, you should have a little more time outdoors this year, despite the fact that you live in Canada. I think that's been a real challenge. I will say some interesting innovations that our wonderful directors of athletic directors, both Mrs. Besson and Mr. Scarrett, respectively, at each school, they've actually used fitness apps in a unique way, where students are tracking their own daily fitness in the way that we would, doing exercises that they can video themselves of and log into a fitness app. I think, you know, in the long term, things like Fitbits, Apple Watches, these are all can become part of physical education. And I would even venture to argue that might be a better educational experience. I mean, instead of just going for one 52-minute period and playing basketball, if your whole physical education experience is around wellness and health overall, right? Like ongoing walking and keeping yourself in good shape throughout the day, that might be a really interesting change. Although I don't think Orchaim boys are going to give up on basketball that easily. Okay, so Rabbi Sonenberg is giving me the stink eye. It was very nice
nodding and agreeing with you
to share this opportunity to discuss with you. All of us are available to continue this conversation. We're all passionate in our own ways about this topic and obviously what we do. And so please, you know, feel free to reach out to us at any point. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful night, a Shabbat Shalom, and we look forward to the next session.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, Mr. Rapp.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sohila.